excited to be here today. I was thrilled when Tracy told me about this event because I think it's so important that we talk about it. It's a big passion of mine. As Daniel said, I work at the Pennsylvania Family Institute, and one big thing we do is advocate for the sanctity of life. So I was asked, in addition to all the things we do, I was asked to bring some handouts on the Uniform Parentage Act, really bad legislation that would expand surrogacy, remove what few protections we have for kids born through surrogacy. So that's just an example of the work we do. I have handouts in the back, and I'm happy to talk with you about that. But I'm not here today as a policy analyst. I'm here today as an IVF baby. And I think that my thoughts surprise a lot of people. I'm sure you all here probably know what my opinions are given the environment that we're in. But I'm just so thankful that God has given me an opportunity to speak into this and a personal tie into it. So I need to start with my parents' story, because this is just as much my parents' story, if not more, than it is mine. I am very close with my parents still. I call my mom my better than a best friend. They're wonderful people, and they were kind of wild when they met, and they were also CPAs, which sounds like a little bit of an oxymoron, but my mom is a foot shorter than my dad. They were coworkers, and she walked up to him and grabbed his tie and said, "I want you," because she wanted paperwork from him. And then it took 3 months after that for them to get engaged, and 3 months later they were married on the riverboat romance. So that kind of starts out the kind of people that they were. But my mom never had, once they were married, she never had any desire to have kids. She even said growing up, she never got super excited about babies, never had any kind of maternal instincts, and was kind of happily enjoying married life until a coworker pulled her aside and said, "Hey, if you ever think that you might possibly maybe want kids, you need to start trying yesterday," because my parents got married a little later, and she was like, "Hey, you can't just wait indefinitely on this." And for whatever reason, I think that would offend some people if a coworker told you that, but I think it was the Holy Spirit, because for whatever reason, that conversation just flipped a switch for my mom, and she just desperately wanted kids after that. That was all that it took. And so my parents started trying, and they found out that they were struggling with infertility. And we can't talk about IVF, we can't have this conversation today without first acknowledging just the deep, deep pain of infertility. And this is something I've talked with my mom about, but she said, like, as soon as they started trying and couldn't have kids, everyone around them suddenly got pregnant really easily. And they saw pregnant women everywhere and babies everywhere. And it just feels so isolating and so lonely and just so crippling. And so I just want to say and acknowledge how hard that is. And that is very much a part of my parents' story. So of course they started looking into, what do we do now? What are our solutions? And they found IVF. And they didn't really have many questions about whether or not this was right or wrong. They did go to a pastor, so we're Protestants, although I'm a big fan of a lot of Catholic social teaching, and I think you guys are light years ahead of many Protestants when it comes to the way that you engage and think on these issues, hence this conference today. But she went to a pastor, my parents did, and said, right, wrong, IVF, should we do it? And their pastor simply said, you know, if God wants you to get pregnant, you will, regardless of whether you do IVF or not, so it's fine. Which, yes, God is sovereign, but that's a terrible way to make moral decisions of, like, if you can physically do it, God agrees with it. Absolutely not. No other way would we say that's okay. But I think this pastor was just completely ill-equipped to talk about IVF, had no idea probably really what it was, didn't think about it. So my parents didn't think anything else. They went full steam ahead. Very, very hard. And I was here for some of the talk before me. IVF is really, really hard on women. A lot of shots, as it was in that picture that the doctor before me showed, and just the emotional ups and downs and the fresh, emotional weight of IVF as well. It was a lot for my mom. They ended up extracting 43 eggs from her, which was she was 39 going on 40, and that was kind of a record for a woman of her age at that practice. And her first round of IVF, they put 3 embryos in her, and she goes to the doctor afterwards, and he talks to her just very normally. When you're pregnant, you go through a lot of different doctor's appointments, and he goes, if things keep progressing the way they are, here's how we decide which to selectively reduce. And she was like, whoa, what does that mean? Selectively reduce is a very Orwellian way of saying abortion. So it's very standard with IVF that if multiples implant, if multiples stick, because again, they're just throwing everything they can. They want you to get a baby. So it's very normal to implant multiples at once. And because my mom was 40 years old, it was considered high risk. And so he said, yeah, so you have to decide which ones you want to keep and which not. And here's how we go about that. And my mom was just flabbergasted of like, it felt like someone slapped her in the face, because she so desperately wanted to get pregnant, has gone through all of the work to get pregnant, all of the shots, all of the hormones, all the resources, all the time, and now this doctor is suggesting that she kill some of the babies that she's finally pregnant with. And so she pushed back and said, absolutely not, that's not gonna happen, I'm not gonna do that. And she left that appointment feeling this doctor pushed and pushed and pushed, and she left that appointment crying, feeling like she was a bad mom for not agreeing to what this doctor was pressuring her to do. How perverted and warped and twisted is that? And I'm so thankful for my mom and the bravery and the resolve that she had, because I think pretty often, what if I had been a baby that was selectively reduced? I wouldn't be here today. There's no way that the doctors really know who makes it and who doesn't. And unfortunately, I was the only baby that made it through that pregnancy naturally. But I'm just so thankful for my mom. And so fast forward a year later, they had me, I was born, and my dad starts to want to have more kids. They still have embryos remaining, because remember, they took 43 eggs from my mom. And my parents actually, I didn't write this in my blog, my mom's okay with me sharing this, my parents actually had to go to counseling to decide, what do we do now with the remaining embryos? They had 10 embryos left. And so they didn't want 10 kids. Again, my mom's 40, but they didn't know what to do. And so it was a really, really hard time for my parents to decide, are we just gonna leave them in a freezer indefinitely? Which, by the way, there is over 1 million babies in freezers right now in the US alone. And that's that we know of. All the statistics that we hear today that we're talking about, there's no standardized reporting or requirements for getting this information. So I'm sure it's much more than 1 million, but 1 million people, 1 million souls are in freezers right now. We should all be deeply unsettled and uncomfortable with that. So they had to decide, are they gonna just rent a freezer for the rest of their lives for these babies, and then who knows what happens when they die? Are they going to put their embryos up for adoption and then maybe run into a kid that looks like them and always be wondering, is that our baby? Is it not? Are they going to kill, destroy these babies? What are they going to do? And so after they were in counseling for a while, they decided to try and use the rest of their embryos. And so there was 10 left. And then after thawing them, the clinic told my mom that there was only 5 viable embryos left. This is another thing that I think really highlights and exposes the fertility industry. And I say fertility industry not in natural ways to restore fertility, but in the big IVF, assisted reproductive fertility industry. But I think it really exposes them, because I asked my mom, what do you mean viable or not? And because I've now since found out, since my work in the pro-life realm, that a lot of these different clinics have ranking for embryos to say, this is higher quality, this is lower quality. There's a lot of different methods that they use, a lot of different standards that they use, and it's different from clinic to clinic. So one clinic can say this is the best embryo, and another one can say this is. It's very, very subjective, and that these are human lives that we're ranking and grading. That's the eugenics really show when we're talking about the way that IVF handles different embryos. But my mom still to this day doesn't know if those 5 unviable embryos truly died in the thawing process, or if they were just ranked not as high quality. She also doesn't know of her 43 eggs, exactly how many of those were fertilized and how they decided which ones to keep and which not. So the way that the fertility industry just so cavalierly treats life, and that I have siblings that were destroyed in that process, but I don't even know how many. My mom doesn't know how many. They didn't tell her any of these things. And they also did not tell her initially that by the way, we're going to make all these embryos, and then you're going to have a really difficult decision and conversation with your husband about what to do if you don't want all of those kids. That's not even on their radar. It wasn't part of the discussion. It's not something anyone warned them about. It was something that they had to decide after the fact. So my mom is basically told you have 5 embryos left. So she uses all of those and doesn't get pregnant. And my parents ended up adopting my little brother from Guatemala. And that's kind of the end of their story as far as IVF goes. And it's nothing that I really thought about a lot growing up. I always knew that my parents used IVF to get pregnant with me. And I just thought, wow, my parents really wanted me. Like, that's a good feeling. But I never thought about the moral aspect of it until in high school and in college, God really, really put on my heart a passion for the sanctity of life and for the unborn. And so I started to research, I started to get internships, I started to work more in that world, and eventually got the job that I have today. And the more and more work that I did into it, the more I realized that the sanctity of life doesn't just apply to abortion, but it also applies to IVF. And the more and more I learned about the IVF industry, the more and more I could point to my parents' story and see all of the patterns and the problems. And so I can very confidently say that as happy as I am to be here today, and as thankful as I am for my life and for my parents, that there are so many problems with IVF, and it is so, so, so destructive to life. And so I think that's highlighted again with the very eugenicist way that the IVF industry sees embryos. It's basically created a world where you can kind of have designer babies, where couples can pick and choose exactly what they want for their children, where if it's possible that you might have a disability, then you're not making it as an embryo through IVF. And there's a really infamous example that I came across that I'm sure a lot of you have probably seen headlines, but Paris Hilton has been a celebrity for decades. And she has over 20 sons in a freezer because she really, really wanted a little girl. And so she just kept going through IVF and going through IVF and going through IVF until she got a daughter. And my parents' story, these kinds of stories are not just one-off kind of crazy examples, but this is what happens when we move away from God's perfect design for marriage and for life. Reminds me, I just came across a Charlie Kirk video, as a lot has been circulating after that tragedy. And he said, it was really interesting, I never thought about it this way, but he said that IVF is the exact opposite of abortion, and that they're 2 sides of the same bad coin, where abortion is all about sex without life, and IVF is all about life without sex. And whenever we remove ourselves from the way that God intended those two to go together, it shouldn't surprise us that we see the callous way that the IVF industry is treating life. And I think that was really illustrated by the doctor who just matter-of-factly, like any other day, hey, we need to draw your blood. Hey, we need to decide which of your babies to kill. Because when you start to devalue life, when you start to treat life like a commodity, then you grow those calluses that are never meant to be there. When we try and make ourselves God, of course we're going to see the kind of breakdown that we see. And I think, if you take anything away from my story and from my parents' story, it was interesting. I was talking to my mom, and I was asking her as I was preparing for this, hey, can I tell all of these details? Because my parents are very comfortable with me sharing everything. And my mom has always given me her full blessing to share everything. My dad has always given me his full blessing, because their perspective is that God is a great redeemer. And they see the platform and the opportunities that God has given me to share this as a redemption of, we have made mistakes. We didn't know any better. We didn't have any of that information. Nobody told us. We didn't even think to ask about these things. And so my mom always feels that if our story can help encourage people, can be used to spread what is true, because God has shown us what is true, then that's a beautiful act of God's redemption. And so I'm so thankful for the way that I came about, not because I think IVF is a good thing. I think IVF is a really harmful, destructive thing. but because it's given me an opportunity to speak to it, because I understand this isn't fun to talk about, because almost every time that someone is encountering IVF, it's because they're dealing with the pain of infertility. And so it's really unpopular and it's really uncomfortable if a friend or a neighbor or a family member or a coworker tells you, I'm dealing with this pain, I'm thinking about pursuing IVF. It's hard to step into that, I understand, and to say, hey, you can't do that. Nobody wants to be that person. Baby, I was just telling Tracy, I had my son's first birthday party last night. I think babies are the greatest thing ever. And I'm sure everyone in here agrees with me. So we never want to tell someone, you can't have kids, you can't have babies, that's not a good thing. But we can't do it at the expense and at the cost of other lives. I saw a statistic that 93% of lives created through IVF are destroyed. That means 7% make it. What other kind of treatment is that acceptable for? Nowhere else would that be acceptable, that there's a 7% survival rate. And yet, we've believed the lies from the IVF industry that this is the only solution, that this is the only thing we can do, when it's not. So I hope that you now feel encouraged to, if this is something that you're considering, to look into the other facts, if this is something that someone tells you about, to understand that the most loving thing you can do, in addition to praying with them and being a shoulder to cry on, is giving them the facts about IVF. It is not loving to just blindly agree with someone where they go down that path and then look back like my parents and see the wake in their path, the destruction of life that got to them this point. And I know that my parents wish that they had more information, that they know what they did today, but now we do. Now we have the information, now we have the knowledge, and now we have even better alternatives where we can heal the root of infertility. We can heal the underlying health issues. And so I think that is why it is so important that we take a stand, and I hope that everyone here is encouraged to do that. So thank you.